Subscribe to my channel because more beautiful videos are waiting for you later.
The long winter of the North. More than 1,000 years ago, the far northern lands of Europe were some of the harshest places where people tried to build a life. Winter there was not simply cold, it was dark, relentless, and long. In the northern regions of Scandinavia, what we now know as Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland, the winter season could stretch for many months. Snow buried the ground, ice covered rivers and seas. The sun sometimes appeared only briefly during the day. For people living in warmer parts of the world, survival in such conditions might seem impossible without modern heating, insulation, or powerful fireplaces. Yet the Vikings, the seafaring Norse people of the early medieval period, lived through these winters year after year. They farmed, raised families, sailed oceans, and even expanded across the North Atlantic. They reached Greenland and briefly settled in North America long before many other Europeans traveled that far. One of the most surprising parts of Viking life is that many of their homes did not rely on the large stone fireplaces people imagine when thinking of winter survival. Instead, Vikings used different methods: clever architecture, shared heat, insulation, and daily routines to survive temperatures that could easily fall far below freezing. To understand how they managed this, we must first imagine the world they lived in. The northern landscape during winter was quiet. Snow blanketed forests of pine and birch trees. The wind coming from the Arctic Ocean could cut through clothing and skin alike. Storms sometimes lasted for days. The ocean itself, which Vikings depended on for travel and fishing, became dangerous and unpredictable. Food became scarce during these months. Farming was impossible while the land was frozen. The animals that provided milk and meat had to be protected from the cold. Even gathering firewood required planning because trees could be buried under snow. But the Vikings were not helpless victims of the climate. Over generations, they developed systems that allowed them to adapt. Their homes were built specifically to trap warmth. Their clothing used layers of wool and animal skins. Their daily life during winter was organized around conserving energy and maintaining heat. One of the most important elements of Viking survival was the longhouse. The longhouse was the central building of Viking settlements. Unlike modern houses divided into many rooms, a Viking longhouse was typically one large hall where much of life took place together. Families, servants, and sometimes animals all stayed within the same structure. This design was not accidental. The walls of longhouses were thick and heavy. Builders often used a combination of timber frames packed with layers of turf, earth, and sometimes stones. Turf, blocks of soil held together by grass roots, worked as excellent insulation. It trapped air and slowed the movement of cold from the outside. In winter, snow would accumulate along the outside walls. Instead of being a problem, this snow actually helped the house stay warmer by adding another insulating layer. The roofs were steep and covered with thatch or turf as well. The thickness of the roof kept warm air from escaping too quickly. Inside the longhouse, there was often a central hearth, but it was not always a traditional fireplace with a chimney like those seen in later European houses. Instead, it was usually an open fire pit running along the center of the hall. The smoke from the fire would slowly drift upward and escape through vents or gaps in the roof. This system might sound uncomfortable to modern ears, but it served multiple purposes. The fire provided warmth, light, and a place to cook food. The smoke, though irritating at times, also helped preserve the wooden structure by discouraging insects and mold. More importantly, the longhouse was designed so that heat from the hearth spread throughout the building. Sleeping platforms ran along the walls, raised slightly above the ground. Thick furs, wool blankets, and straw bedding trapped body heat during the night. But architecture alone did not keep Vikings alive through winter. Community was equally important. During the coldest months, people spent much of their time indoors. Activities that required warmth and light were done around the hearth. Women spun wool into yarn. Men repaired tools, carved wood, or prepared fishing equipment for the coming spring. Storytelling also played a major role in winter life. The famous Norse sagas, stories about heroes, voyages, and gods, were often shared during these long nights. These stories were not only entertainment, but also a way to preserve history and knowledge. The winter season, therefore, became a time of gathering rather than isolation. Another surprising element of Viking winter survival was the presence of animals inside the living space. In some longhouses, livestock such as sheep, goats, or even small cattle were kept in areas close to the main hall. Animals produce body heat, and in a closed structure, that warmth helped maintain a slightly higher temperature. While it might not have been comfortable by modern standards, the extra warmth could make the difference between freezing and surviving. Food storage was also critical. Because fresh crops could not be harvested during winter, Vikings preserved large amounts of food during the autumn months. Fish were dried or smoked. Meat was salted or hung in cool storage areas. Grain harvested in summer was kept dry for making bread or porridge. Fermented foods were common as well. These foods not only lasted longer, but sometimes provided additional nutrients during a season when fresh vegetables were rare. Water was another challenge. In freezing conditions, rivers and wells could become difficult to access. Snow could be melted, but doing so required fuel. As a result, Vikings often planned settlements near water sources that were less likely to freeze completely, such as flowing streams or coastal areas influenced by ocean currents. Clothing played an equally vital role in survival. Vikings wore layered garments made primarily from wool. Wool has a special advantage in cold climates. It retains warmth even when damp. Under their wool clothing, they might wear linen garments for comfort. Over this, they added cloaks lined with fur or thick wool. Leather boots lined with fur protected their feet from snow and ice. Gloves and hoods were essential during outdoor work. This clothing system meant that Vikings could still travel outside during winter when necessary, whether to check animals, gather wood, or hunt. Fuel management was another important skill. Wood was the primary source of fuel for Viking fires, but forests were not always relied upon in every region. In Iceland, for example, trees were scarce. There, people often used driftwood collected from beaches or even dried animal dung as fuel. Because fuel was limited, fires were carefully controlled rather than burned constantly at full strength. People gathered around the hearth to share warmth rather than heating separate rooms. In this way, the Viking approach to winter survival relied less on large fireplaces and more on efficient use of shared heat. By combining insulation, shared living spaces, layered clothing, preserved food, and strong community traditions, Vikings managed to survive some of the harshest winters on Earth. And over time, winter itself became part of their cultural rhythm. It was not merely a season of hardship, it was also a season of stories, craftsmanship, planning, and quiet endurance beneath the long northern night. Yet even with these strategies, winter in the Viking world could still be dangerous. Storms could destroy homes, food supplies could run low, illness could spread quickly inside crowded houses. In the next part, we will explore the remarkable engineering of Viking longhouses in greater detail and how their design trapped warmth so effectively that entire families could survive months of freezing temperatures without relying on massive fireplaces.
The engineering of the Viking longhouse.
When we imagine survival in the frozen north 1,000 years ago, it is easy to picture roaring fireplaces and thick stone castles. But Viking homes were very different. Their survival depended not on massive fireplaces, but on careful building design, developed over generations of experience living in some of the coldest environments in Europe. The Viking longhouse was not just a place to sleep, it was the center of life. It was where people worked, ate, told stories, repaired tools, and sheltered during storms that could rage for days. These buildings were designed with one clear goal in mind: keeping warmth inside while blocking the brutal northern wind. Most Viking longhouses were built in a long, rectangular shape. Some were modest structures about 20 meters long, while others belonging to powerful chiefs could reach 60 meters or more. Despite the size differences, the basic design remained similar across Viking lands. The longhouse was built low to the ground. Unlike tall structures that allow wind to strike their walls directly, the longhouse's low profile helped it resist strong winter storms. The curved shape of the roof also allowed heavy snow to slide down rather than accumulate until collapse. The materials used in construction were carefully chosen based on what the local environment provided. Timber formed the skeleton of the building. Thick wooden posts were driven deep into the ground to support the weight of the roof. Horizontal beams connected these posts, creating a strong frame capable of withstanding winter winds. But wood alone could not keep out the cold. To solve this problem, Vikings filled the spaces between wooden frames with layers of turf and earth. Turf blocks were cut directly from the ground, including grass, soil, and roots. These blocks were stacked like bricks to form thick insulating walls. Turf had an important advantage. The soil and plant roots trapped pockets of air. Air is a poor conductor of heat, which means it slows the movement of warmth from inside the building to the cold outside air. In modern terms, turf acted like natural insulation. Some walls were nearly a meter thick. Once the structure was complete, the outside of the building often blended into the landscape, almost like a small grassy hill rising from the ground. During winter, snow would pile up against the outer walls. Instead of weakening the structure, this snow layer provided even more insulation. The house became wrapped in a natural blanket that helped keep interior temperatures more stable. The roof was another crucial feature. Viking roofs were typically steep and supported by heavy beams running along the center of the house. Over these beams, builders laid wooden rafters and covered them with layers of branches, straw, and finally, turf. A turf roof was heavy, but it worked extremely well in cold climates. The thick layer of soil blocked wind and held warmth inside the building. Grass growing on the roof during warmer seasons helped hold the turf together and prevent erosion. Inside the longhouse, the arrangement of space was also designed with survival in mind. Running down the center of the hall was a long hearth, a narrow fire pit that stretched along the length of the building. This hearth was the heart of the home. Fires burned there throughout the day and often into the night. Unlike modern fireplaces with chimneys, Viking hearths allowed smoke to rise freely toward the roof. Small openings in the roof allowed some smoke to escape, though the process was slow. The interior of the longhouse often contained a thin layer of smoke drifting near the ceiling. While this might sound unpleasant, it actually had benefits. Smoke helped protect the engineering of the Viking longhouse. When we imagine survival in the frozen north 1,000 years ago, it is easy to picture roaring fireplaces and thick stone castles. But Viking homes were very different. Their survival depended not on massive fireplaces, but on careful building design, developed over generations of experience living in some of the coldest environments in Europe. The Viking longhouse was not just a place to sleep, it was the center of life. It was where people worked, ate, told stories, repaired tools, and sheltered during storms that could rage for days. These buildings were designed with one clear goal in mind: keeping warmth inside while blocking the brutal northern wind. Most Viking longhouses were built in a long, rectangular shape. Some were modest structures about 20 meters long, while others belonging to powerful chiefs could reach 60 meters or more. Despite the size differences, the basic design remained similar across Viking lands. The longhouse was built low to the ground. Unlike tall structures that allow wind to strike their walls directly, the longhouse's low profile helped it resist strong winter storms. The curved shape of the roof also allowed heavy snow to slide down rather than accumulate until collapse. The materials used in construction were carefully chosen based on what the local environment provided. Timber formed the skeleton of the building. Thick wooden posts were driven deep into the ground to support the weight of the roof. Horizontal beams connected these posts, creating a strong frame capable of withstanding winter winds. But wood alone could not keep out the cold. To solve this problem, Vikings filled the spaces between wooden frames with layers of turf and earth. Turf blocks were cut directly from the ground, including grass, soil, and roots. These blocks were stacked like bricks to form thick insulating walls. Turf had an important advantage. The soil and plant roots trapped pockets of air. Air is a poor conductor of heat, which means it slows the movement of warmth from inside the building to the cold outside air. In modern terms, turf acted like natural insulation. Some walls were nearly a meter thick. Once the structure was complete, the outside of the building often blended into the landscape, almost like a small grassy hill rising from the ground. During winter, snow would pile up against the outer walls. Instead of weakening the structure, this snow layer provided even more insulation. The house became wrapped in a natural blanket that helped keep interior temperatures more stable. The roof was another crucial feature. Viking roofs were typically steep and supported by heavy beams running along the center of the house. Over these beams, builders laid wooden rafters and covered them with layers of branches, straw, and finally, turf. A turf roof was heavy, but it worked extremely well in cold climates. The thick layer of soil blocked wind and held warmth inside the building. Grass growing on the roof during warmer seasons helped hold the turf together and prevent erosion. Inside the longhouse, the arrangement of space was also designed with survival in mind. Running down the center of the hall was a long hearth, a narrow fire pit that stretched along the length of the building. This hearth was the heart of the home. Fires burned there throughout the day and often into the night. Unlike modern fireplaces with chimneys, Viking hearths allowed smoke to rise freely toward the roof. Small openings in the roof allowed some smoke to escape, though the process was slow. The interior of the longhouse often contained a thin layer of smoke drifting near the ceiling. While this might sound unpleasant, it actually had benefits. Smoke helped protect wooden beams from insects and rot. It also dried the air slightly, preventing moisture from building up inside the structure. More importantly, the heat from the hearth radiated outward in all directions. Because the longhouse was a single large space rather than many small rooms, this heat could spread across the building. Sleeping platforms were placed along the side walls. These platforms were raised above the ground and covered with straw, wool blankets, and animal furs. Raising the sleeping areas served two purposes. First, it kept people away from the cold ground. Second, warm air rising from the hearth naturally moved toward the sides of the building, where it could help keep sleepers warmer during the night. During the coldest winter nights, families often slept close together beneath layers of fur. Shared body heat added another source of warmth. Doors were another weak point in any building facing Arctic winds. Viking builders minimized this problem by designing entrances carefully. Many longhouses had small entryways or short corridors rather than a simple door opening directly into the hall. These small passage spaces acted like wind traps, preventing cold air from rushing straight inside when the door was opened. In some cases, doors were also covered with thick animal hides or wooden panels to block wind. Window. Preparing for the long winter. The Viking food strategy. For the Vikings, surviving the winter was not something that began when the first snow fell. The real preparation started many months earlier, during the bright days of spring and the long working hours of summer. Every task performed during the warmer seasons had one purpose in mind: ensuring that when winter arrived, the community would have enough food to last until the return of the sun and the thawing of the earth. In the far north, the growing season was short. Crops had only a few months to mature before the cold returned. Because of this, Vikings had to use every available resource carefully. Farming, fishing, hunting, and gathering were all part of a larger survival strategy. One of the most important crops grown by Vikings was barley. Barley was hardy and could grow in colder climates where other grains might fail. The grain could be made to bread, porridge, and even ale. During the summer harvest, barley was carefully dried and stored in large wooden containers or underground storage pits, where it would remain dry throughout the winter. Rye and oats were also grown in some regions, though barley remained the most reliable grain in northern environments. Vegetables played a role as well, though fewer varieties could survive the northern climate. Vikings commonly grew cabbage, onions, leeks, and turnips. These vegetables were hardy and could last longer in storage than more delicate plants. Root vegetables were especially valuable because they could remain edible even after being stored for months in cool, dark places. But crops alone could not sustain a Viking community through the winter. Animal products were just as important. Vikings raised livestock such as sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle. These animals provided meat, milk, cheese, wool, and hides. However, feeding animals during winter required careful planning. Grass disappeared beneath the snow, so farmers had to cut and dry large quantities of hay during the summer months. Hay was stored in barns or lofts and used to feed animals when pastures were covered in snow. Without enough hay, livestock could starve before spring returned. Because of this, farmers often had to make difficult choices about which animals to keep alive through the winter. Some animals were slaughtered in autumn to provide meat that could be preserved. Others were kept alive for their milk or for breeding the following year. Preserving meat was one of the most important survival skills Vikings possessed. Fresh meat spoils quickly, especially in large quantities. To avoid waste, Vikings developed several methods to preserve food for long periods. One common method was drying. Fish and thin strips of meat could be hung in open air, where cold winds slowly removed moisture. Without moisture, bacteria struggled to grow, allowing the food to last for months. Another technique was smoking. Meat or fish was hung above slow-burning fires inside special buildings or near the hearth of the longhouse. The smoke helped dry the meat while also coating it with chemicals that slowed decay. Salt preservation was used as well, though salt was sometimes difficult to obtain in northern areas. Where available, meat could be heavily salted and stored in barrels. Fermentation was another valuable technique. Certain foods, especially fish, could be fermented in controlled ways that prevented spoilage while creating strong flavors. While such foods might taste unusual to modern people, they were reliable sources of nutrition during winter months. Fish was particularly important in the Viking diet. Many Viking settlements were located near rivers, lakes, or coastlines. Fishing provided a steady supply of protein that could be preserved for later use. Cod, herring, and other cold water fish were commonly caught and dried. In some areas, dried fish became so durable that it could last for years if stored properly. This made it an ideal winter food. Hunting also contributed to the winter food supply. Deer, elk, wild boar, and smaller animals such as rabbits could provide fresh meat during autumn hunts. The hides from these animals were used for clothing and bedding, while the meat was preserved. Birds and their eggs were collected in the warmer months, though eggs could not be stored as long as other foods. Dairy products played an important role as well. During the summer, cows, goats, and sheep produced milk that could be turned into cheese, butter, and fermented milk products. Cheese, in particular, was valuable because it could last a long time if stored properly. Butter could also be preserved by placing it in sealed containers or burying it in cool soil. Archaeologists have even discovered ancient butter preserved in bogs, where cold and low oxygen levels prevented spoilage for centuries. Once winter arrived, the Viking diet changed significantly. Fresh vegetables became rare, and most meals relied on preserved foods. A typical winter meal might include porridge made from barley, accompanied by dried fish or smoked meat. Stews were common because they allowed small amounts of meat to flavor larger portions of grain or vegetables. Cooking often took place directly over the central hearth inside the longhouse. Iron pots were suspended above the fire using chains or hooks. Stone pots or clay vessels might be used as well. Stews could simmer for hours, filling the longhouse with warmth and the smell of cooking food. In a season when daylight was limited, warm meals were an important comfort. Ale was also a common drink. Made from fermented barley, it provided both calories and hydration. Water alone was sometimes avoided because untreated water sources could carry disease, while the brewing process helped make ale safer to drink. Despite careful planning, winter could still bring danger. If crops failed during the previous summer, or if livestock died unexpectedly, food supplies might run low before spring arrived. In such cases, communities sometimes had to ration their supplies carefully. Fishing through holes cut in the ice might provide additional food, though this required skill and patience. Hunting during winter was possible, but difficult because animals were scarce and the cold made travel dangerous. Because of these risks, Vikings valued cooperation within their communities. Families shared resources, and powerful leaders were expected to provide for their followers during difficult times. The success of this system meant that Viking societies could endure winters that lasted for many months. By combining farming, animal husbandry, fishing, hunting, and food preservation, they created a food supply capable of sustaining life even when the land itself seemed frozen and lifeless. But food and shelter were only part of the story. Even with warm homes and stored food, surviving winter required strong clothing designed specifically for extreme cold. Without proper clothing, a short trip outside could quickly become dangerous. In the next part, we will explore how Vikings designed their clothing, from wool garments to fur-lined cloaks, and how these layers allowed them to work, travel, and hunt even during the harsh Arctic winter.
Clothing for the frozen world. Even with well-built longhouses and carefully stored food, Viking survival during winter depended heavily on something much more personal: clothing. In a land where temperatures could drop far below freezing and icy winds swept across open landscapes, the right clothing could mean the difference between life and death. The Vikings did not have modern materials like synthetic insulation or waterproof fabrics. Instead, they relied on the resources available in their environment. Over generations, they learned how to use wool, linen, leather, and fur to create clothing that protected them from the cold while still allowing them to move, work, and travel. Their clothing system was built on a simple but powerful idea: layers. Layers trap air between pieces of clothing, and that trapped air warms up from body heat. Once warmed, the air helps maintain a stable temperature around the body. This same principle is used today in modern cold weather gear, but the Vikings discovered it through practical experience long before scientific explanations existed. The layer closest to the skin was usually made from linen. Linen was produced from the fibers of the flax plant. It was comfortable, breathable, and relatively soft against the skin. While linen itself did not provide much warmth, it served an important role by keeping the body dry and preventing rough wool from rubbing directly against the skin. Moisture control was important in cold climates. Sweat trapped against the body could quickly become dangerous if it cooled down. Linen helped absorb moisture and keep the skin more comfortable. Over the linen layer, Vikings wore wool garments. Wool was the most important fabric in Viking clothing. Sheep were raised across Scandinavia, and their wool provided a steady supply of material that could be spun into yarn and woven into cloth inside the longhouse. Producing enough cloth for clothing required many hours of work, especially during the winter months when outdoor tasks were limited. Typical wool garments included long tunics, trousers for men, and layered dresses for women. These garments were often simple in shape, but carefully fitted to keep warmth close to the body. Over these wool layers, Vikings added cloaks and outer garments designed to block wind and snow. Cloaks were extremely common. They were usually large pieces of thick wool fabric draped around the shoulders and fastened with a brooch or pin. These cloaks could be wrapped tightly during cold weather or loosened when moving indoors. Some cloaks were lined with animal fur, which added additional warmth. Fur traps air within its fibers and acts as a natural insulator. In extremely cold regions, fur-lined garments could be essential. Furs came from animals such as foxes, wolves, bears, and sheep. Sheep fleece itself could be worn with the wool facing inward, creating a soft and warm interior layer. Leather also played an important role in Viking clothing. Leather was strong, flexible, and relatively resistant to wind. It was commonly used for belts, gloves, boots, and sometimes outer garments. Foot protection was particularly important in winter conditions. Viking boots were typically made of leather and designed to fit closely around the foot. Inside the boots, people sometimes added wool or animal fur for insulation. Some boots were wrapped with cloth strips around the lower leg, creating extra layers that helped block cold air and snow. Walking through snow and ice for long periods could quickly chill the feet. Proper footwear helped prevent frostbite and allowed people to continue working outdoors when necessary. Hands and heads also required protection. Gloves made from leather or wool kept fingers warm during tasks like cutting wood, carrying water, or repairing equipment. Because fingers lose heat quickly, even simple gloves could make a big difference. Hoods and hats were equally important. A large amount of body heat escapes from the head, especially in cold wind. Wool hoods, fur hats, or wrapped cloth coverings helped trap warmth and protect the ears and neck. In strong storms, Vikings might pull their cloaks tightly around their bodies and lower their hoods to shield their faces from blowing snow.
Clothing was not only about warmth, it also reflected identity and status within Viking society. Wealthier individuals sometimes wore garments dyed with bright colors. Natural dyes made from plants, lichens, and minerals could produce shades of red, blue, yellow, and green. While everyday winter clothing often focused on practicality, decorative elements such as embroidery or patterned weaving still appeared in some garments. Jewelry such as brooches, rings, and armbands also helped secure clothing layers while displaying wealth or craftsmanship. Maintaining clothing during winter required constant care. Wet garments had to be dried near the hearth to prevent freezing. Tears in fabric were quickly repaired using needles made of bone or metal. The longhouse's hearth often served as a place where clothing hung to dry after journeys through snow or rain. The rising warmth from the fire slowly removed moisture from wool and leather. Children learned early how to care for their clothing because damaged garments in winter could lead to dangerous exposure to cold. While clothing allowed Vikings to survive outdoors for limited periods, they still spent most winter days inside the shelter of the longhouse. Venturing outside during severe storms was risky, and many activities were postponed until the weather improved. Yet some tasks could not be avoided. Wood still needed to be gathered for fuel. Animals required care and feeding. Ice sometimes had to be broken to reach water sources. In coastal regions, fishermen occasionally ventured onto icy waters to catch fish through holes in the frozen surface. These activities required courage, skill, and proper clothing. The layered system of linen, wool, leather, and fur allowed Vikings to face the cold with a level of protection that had been refined over generations. Still, even the best clothing could not fully protect someone who remained outside for too long in extreme cold. For this reason, winter life was carefully organized around minimizing unnecessary exposure to the elements. The longhouse remained the center of warmth and safety, while the outside world during winter was treated with caution and respect. But another factor also played a surprising role in maintaining warmth inside Viking homes. It was something that might seem unusual to modern readers: the presence of animals within or near the living space. In the next part, we will explore how livestock and human life were closely connected during the Viking winter, and how animals themselves helped provide warmth and survival during the darkest months of the year.
Health and survival in the cold. Winter in the far north tested more than just strength and courage. Even with warm houses, food, clothing, and careful travel, Viking communities had to contend with illness, injury, and the physical strain of the cold. Surviving winter required knowledge, preparation, and communal care. One of the most common challenges was frostbite and hypothermia. Exposure to extreme cold for too long could damage fingers, toes, ears, and noses. In severe cases, it could lead to dangerous loss of body heat, slowed heart rate, and unconsciousness. Vikings were aware of these risks, even without modern medical terminology. Layered clothing, fur, and careful planning limited exposure to freezing conditions. Children were taught from a young age how to recognize warning signs and protect themselves. Nutrition also played a role in survival. The preserved foods stored in autumn, dried fish, smoked meat, root vegetables, and grains provided essential calories to generate body heat. Ale and fermented milk added additional nutrients. Communities carefully rationed supplies, knowing that running out of food during a storm could be fatal. People who were undernourished were more susceptible to cold and illness. Illness could strike quickly in winter. The longhouse, while warm, also concentrated people together in a confined space. This made the spread of respiratory infections easier. Coughs, fevers, and colds were common. Although Vikings lacked modern medicine, They used herbs, animal fats, and traditional remedies to treat symptoms. Willow bark, which contains compounds similar to modern aspirin, could reduce pain and fever. Certain plants were boiled to create teas that soothed ailments or helped prevent infections. Injuries from tools, woodworking, hunting, or household chores were another concern. Axes, knives, and sharp woodworking tools could cause serious cuts. Broken bones, sprains, and burns were also risks. Vikings developed basic techniques for treating wounds, such as cleaning cuts, wrapping injuries with cloth, and immobilizing broken limbs using splints made from wood. While these measures were simple, they often saved lives and allowed people to recover enough to continue helping their community. Pregnant women and children were particularly vulnerable during winter. Extra attention was given to their care, including warm bedding, sufficient food, and shelter from storms. Midwives played a critical role in assisting births, and families relied on experience and passed down knowledge to help both mothers and infants survive in harsh conditions. Hygiene was another challenge. Washing in cold water was limited, but Vikings used steam from the hearth and small heated water vessels to clean themselves when possible. Keeping living spaces dry and ventilated, while still warm, helped reduce the risk of respiratory issues and mold-related problems. Mental health also mattered. The long, dark nights could feel oppressive, and isolation from other communities during storms was common. Storytelling, music, games, and social gatherings provided relief. These activities reduced stress, reinforced community bonds, and helped maintain morale during a season when survival depended on cooperation and resilience. Religion and spirituality also provided psychological support. Rituals, offerings, and prayers to the Norse gods such as Odin or Thor helped people feel protected from the dangers of winter. Festivals, even during midwinter, offered moments of joy, reflection, and hope for the return of longer days. Even with all precautions, winter remained dangerous. A sudden blizzard could isolate a settlement, a failed food supply could bring hunger, and illness or injury could be deadly if help was not immediately available. Survival required careful planning, constant attention to the environment, and the willingness of every community member to contribute. Despite these challenges, Viking communities endured. Their combination of shelter, layered clothing, preserved food, warmth from animals and hearths, careful travel, and communal care allowed them to survive winters that would have overwhelmed many others. Over generations, this knowledge became refined into traditions that ensured continuity and resilience. In the next part, we will explore winter festivals, traditions, and cultural practices that helped Vikings cope with the darkness, maintain morale, and strengthen social bonds during the harsh Arctic months. Even with warm longhouses, layered clothing, and carefully stored fuel, Vikings could not survive winter by staying inside all the time. Life still demanded movement. Animals needed care, wood had to be gathered, and fishing or hunting could be essential for food supplies. The frozen Arctic landscape created challenges, but Vikings developed practical strategies to move and work safely in snow and ice. Walking through deep snow was exhausting. In regions where snow piled high, ordinary boots were not enough. Vikings often wrapped their legs with cloth strips, creating a kind of primitive gaiter that prevented snow from entering their footwear. Some communities also used simple wooden snowshoes or wide-soled shoes that spread weight over a larger surface, allowing people to travel more easily over soft snow without sinking. Frozen rivers and lakes became natural highways. When the ice was thick enough, it allowed people to move quickly across areas that would have been difficult to traverse otherwise. Traveling by ice saved energy compared to trudging through snow-covered forests. However, Vikings had to be cautious. Ice could crack or be weak in certain areas, and one wrong step could be dangerous. Coastal travel presented its own set of challenges. Fjords and inlets could freeze in extreme winters, but tides and currents often kept parts of the water open. Skilled Viking sailors sometimes adapted their small boats for winter conditions, using them to reach fishing spots or nearby settlements.
Icebreakers were unnecessary, but careful observation of ice conditions was critical to avoid accidents. Hunting continued to play a role in winter survival. While large game was harder to find in deep snow, animals left tracks that Vikings could follow. Deer, elk, and wild birds were common targets. Tools such as spears, bows, and traps were adapted for winter use. Patience was essential. Hunters could spend hours tracking animals through frozen forests, relying on their knowledge of the land and animal behavior. Fishing was another activity that persisted through winter. In rivers and lakes that did not freeze completely, nets and lines could still catch fish. In frozen waters, Vikings practiced ice fishing, cutting holes in the ice to reach the water below. This was dangerous work, requiring skill to avoid falling in or breaking through weak spots in the ice. Even ordinary chores demanded creativity in the frozen landscape. Collecting water meant breaking ice or melting snow, often using heat from a nearby hearth. Transporting supplies sometimes required sleds or simple wooden carts designed to glide over snow. Communities often coordinated these tasks, with several people working together to reduce the effort and danger. Travel and work in winter were not just physical challenges, they were also exercises in preparation and foresight. Vikings needed to anticipate weather patterns, understand the limits of ice and snow, and ensure that resources such as firewood and food remained accessible. Mistakes could be costly, but experience and observation allowed communities to survive year after year. Winter travel also shaped Viking exploration. Early voyages to Greenland and North America relied on knowledge of cold weather sailing and survival. Techniques developed for local winters, such as layered clothing and careful planning, prepared the Vikings for journeys into icy northern waters far from their homes. Yet despite all this activity, winter remained a season of restraint. Most people avoided unnecessary exposure to the elements, limiting trips outdoors to essential tasks. The longhouse, with its warm hearth, preserved food, and sleeping areas, remained the center of life. Still, surviving the Arctic winter involved more than shelter, food, clothing, and movement. Vikings also had to guard against illness and injury, which became especially dangerous in cold and dark conditions.
When the Viking winter settled over the land, the pace of life changed. Fields were frozen, rivers slowed under ice, and travel across the countryside became limited. Yet winter was far from a season of idleness. Inside the longhouse, illuminated by the glow of the hearth, Vikings used these quiet months to focus on craftsmanship and tool-making, essential skills that supported survival during the rest of the year. Every Viking household depended on tools. Axes were needed to cut wood and build structures. Knives were used for carving, food preparation, and countless daily tasks. Fishing gear, farming equipment, and household objects all required careful maintenance. Winter provided the perfect opportunity to repair and create these items. Woodworking was one of the most common indoor activities. Wood was abundant in many parts of Scandinavia, and skilled craftsmen could transform simple logs into bowls, spoons, chests, tool handles, and even decorative carvings. The axe was perhaps the most important tool in Viking life. With it, trees could be cut, beams shaped, and firewood split. During winter evenings, men often inspected their axes carefully. If a wooden handle cracked or loosened, it needed to be replaced before spring. Using knives and smaller carving tools, craftsmen shaped new handles from sturdy pieces of wood such as ash or oak. Once carved, the handle was fitted tightly into the iron axe head and secured firmly so it would not break during heavy use. Knives were equally important. Almost every Viking carried a knife, which served as a multi-purpose tool for cutting food, shaping wood, preparing hides, and performing small repairs. Over time, knives became dull. During winter, people sharpened blades using smooth stones. Careful sharpening ensured that tools would be ready for the demanding work of spring and summer. Metalwork also played a role in Viking craftsmanship, although large-scale metal forging often required more fuel than was practical during the coldest months. Still, smaller repairs could be done using compact hearths or simple forges.
Iron nails, rivets, and fittings were essential for maintaining ships and buildings. Viking ships, famous for their strength and flexibility, were held together using iron rivets that connected wooden planks. These rivets sometimes loosened or rusted over time, and winter repairs ensured that vessels would remain seaworthy. Boat building was one of the greatest achievements of Viking craftsmanship. Although most major ship construction occurred during warmer seasons, winter was the time when craftsmen carved smaller components and prepared materials. Wooden planks might be shaped indoors where they were protected from harsh weather. Ropes and sailing equipment were also maintained during winter. Ropes used on ships were often made from twisted plant fibers or animal hair. Over time, these ropes frayed or weakened. Vikings carefully examined them during winter, replacing worn sections and twisting new strands where necessary. Fishing equipment received similar attention. Fishing nets were delicate tools that could easily tear during use. Women and men both participated in repairing nets by weaving new threads into damaged sections. This work required patience and steady hands. A damaged net left unrepaired could lead to poor fishing results once the ice melted, so winter repairs were essential. Leatherworking was another important skill practiced during the cold months. Animal hides collected during autumn hunts were treated and turned into leather using natural tanning methods. This process often involves soaking hides in mixtures made from bark or other plant materials. Once treated, the leather became strong and flexible. From it, Vikings produced boots, belts, gloves, bags, and protective coverings for tools. Boot repair was especially important during winter. Walking through snow and ice placed heavy strain on footwear. If boots developed holes or weak stitching, cold water and snow could quickly seep inside. Using bone or metal needles and strong thread made from animal sinew, Vikings repaired boots so they would remain durable and warm. Another winter craft involved bone and antler carving. Animal bones and antlers were excellent materials for creating small tools and decorative items. Craftsmen carved them into needles, combs, buttons, and jewelry. These objects were both practical and beautiful. Combs, for example, were essential for grooming hair and maintaining hygiene. Vikings valued personal appearance, and well-made combs were common possessions. Jewelry also held cultural importance. Brooches made from metal or carved bone helped fasten cloaks and clothing. Arm rings and necklaces sometimes displayed wealth or social status. Even during winter, artisans continued producing such items, ensuring that trade and craftsmanship remained active. Children learned many of these skills by watching adults at work. Young boys might begin carving small pieces of wood, while girls practiced spinning wool or weaving thread. These lessons were part of everyday life. Knowledge passed from one generation to the next ensured that Viking communities remained self-sufficient. The longhouse during winter therefore became more than just a shelter from the cold. It was a workshop filled with quiet activity. The crackling of the hearth mixed with the sounds of tools scraping wood, thread passing through cloth, and soft conversations between family members. Outside, storms might rage across the frozen land. Inside, craftsmanship continued steadily, preparing the community for the busy seasons ahead. This careful maintenance and preparation meant that when spring finally arrived, Viking farmers, fishermen, and sailors were ready to return to the demanding work of survival and exploration. Yet winter still held one more challenge: the psychological weight of darkness and isolation. Weeks of cold weather and limited daylight could test the endurance of even the strongest people. Maintaining hope and emotional strength was just as important as maintaining tools and food supplies. In the next part, we will explore how Vikings stayed mentally strong during the long winter, and how their beliefs, traditions, and community support helped them endure the darkest time of the year.
Health and survival in the cold. Winter in the far north tested more than just strength and courage. Even with warm houses, food, clothing, and careful travel, Viking communities had to contend with illness, injury, and the physical strain of the cold. Surviving winter required knowledge, preparation, and communal care. One of the most common challenges was frostbite and hypothermia. Exposure to extreme cold for too long could damage fingers, toes, ears, and noses. In severe cases, it could lead to dangerous loss of body heat, slowed heart rate, and unconsciousness. Vikings were aware of these risks, even without modern medical terminology. Layered clothing, fur, and careful planning limited exposure to freezing conditions. Children were taught from a young age how to recognize warning signs and protect themselves. Nutrition also played a role in survival. The preserved foods stored in autumn, dried fish, smoked meat, root vegetables, and grains provided essential calories to generate body heat.
Ale and fermented milk added additional nutrients. Communities carefully rationed supplies, knowing that running out of food during a storm could be fatal. People who were undernourished were more susceptible to cold and illness. Illness could strike quickly in winter. The longhouse, while warm, also concentrated people together in a confined space. This made the spread of respiratory infections easier. Coughs, fevers, and colds were common. Although Vikings lacked modern medicine, they used herbs, animal fats, and traditional remedies to treat symptoms. Willow bark, which contains compounds similar to modern aspirin, could reduce pain and fever. Certain plants were boiled to create teas that soothed ailments or helped prevent infections. Injuries from tools, woodworking, hunting, or household chores were another concern. Axes, knives, and sharp woodworking tools could cause serious cuts. Broken bones, sprains, and burns were also risks. Vikings developed basic techniques for treating wounds, such as cleaning cuts, wrapping injuries with cloth, and immobilizing broken limbs using splints made from wood. While these measures were simple, they often saved lives and allowed people to recover enough to continue helping their community. Pregnant women and children were particularly vulnerable during winter. Extra attention was given to their care, including warm bedding, sufficient food, and shelter from storms. Midwives played a critical role in assisting births, and families relied on experience and passed down knowledge to help both mothers and infants survive in harsh conditions. Hygiene was another challenge. Washing in cold water was limited, but Vikings used steam from the hearth and small heated water vessels to clean themselves when possible. Keeping living spaces dry and ventilated, while still warm, helped reduce the risk of respiratory issues and mold-related problems. Mental health also mattered. The long, dark nights could feel oppressive, and isolation from other communities during storms was common. Storytelling, music, games, and social gatherings provided relief. These activities reduced stress, reinforced community bonds, and helped maintain morale during a season when survival depended on cooperation and resilience. Religion and spirituality also provided psychological support. Rituals, offerings, and prayers to the Norse gods such as Odin or Thor helped people feel protected from the dangers of winter. Festivals, even during midwinter, offered moments of joy, reflection, and hope for the return of longer days. Even with all precautions, winter remained dangerous. A sudden blizzard could isolate a settlement, a failed food supply could bring hunger, and illness or injury could be deadly if help was not immediately available. Survival required careful planning, constant attention to the environment, and the willingness of every community member to contribute. Despite these challenges, Viking communities endured. Their combination of shelter, layered clothing, preserved food, warmth from animals and hearths, careful travel, and communal care allowed them to survive winters that would have overwhelmed many others. Over generations, this knowledge became refined into traditions that ensured continuity and resilience. In the next part, we will explore winter festivals, traditions, and cultural practices that helped Vikings cope with the darkness, maintain morale, and strengthen social bonds during the harsh Arctic months.
Belief, courage, and the strength of the mind. Surviving a Viking winter required more than warm clothing, food storage, and well-built houses. The cold, darkness, and isolation could weigh heavily on the human mind. Weeks of limited sunlight and harsh storms sometimes kept communities confined indoors for long periods. In such conditions, emotional strength became just as important as physical preparation. For the Vikings, belief and tradition played a powerful role in maintaining that strength. The Norse worldview was filled with stories about courage in the face of hardship. Life itself was understood as a constant struggle against powerful forces, nature, enemies, and fate. These ideas helped shape how Viking communities approached the winter months. Central to their beliefs was the idea of fate. Vikings believed that each person had a destiny that could not easily be changed.
Accepting this belief did not make people passive. Instead, it encouraged them to face challenges with bravery and determination. If storms came, they endured them. If winter brought hardship, they met it with patience and resilience. Stories about the gods reinforced this outlook. The god Odin was associated with wisdom, sacrifice, and the search for knowledge. Legends described how he endured great suffering in his pursuit of understanding the world. Another powerful figure was Thor, known for his strength and courage. Thor was believed to defend the world of humans against giants and chaotic forces. These stories were often told during winter evenings. As people sat around the hearth, the tales reminded them that struggle and endurance were natural parts of existence. Hearing about heroic figures who faced danger without fear inspired listeners to maintain courage during difficult times. Another important concept in Norse culture was honor. Honor was not simply about reputation. It reflected a person's character, reliability, and loyalty to family and community. During winter, when everyone depended on each other, honor became especially important. Each person had responsibilities within the household. Some gathered wood, others prepared food, repaired tools, or cared for animals. Fulfilling these duties showed commitment to the survival of the group. Neglecting responsibilities could endanger the entire household, so cooperation was deeply valued. Winter also provided time for reflection. With fewer outdoor tasks demanding attention, people thought about the events of the past year. Farmers considered whether crops had been successful and how they might improve their fields. Sailors and traders remembered past voyages and began imagining future journeys. Elders often shared wisdom gained through decades of experience. Their stories contained lessons about weather patterns, hunting strategies, and leadership. For younger members of the community, these winter evenings were an opportunity to absorb knowledge that would guide them through their own lives. Spiritual practices also offered comfort. Some families made small offerings to the gods or to the spirits they believed lived within the natural world. Food, drink, or carved objects might be placed in special areas as signs of respect and gratitude. These rituals helped people feel connected to forces beyond their immediate surroundings. Even the harshness of winter was sometimes seen as part of a larger cycle of nature. The freezing cold and deep darkness were temporary. Eventually, the sun would return, snow would melt, and new life would appear in the fields. Believing in this cycle helped maintain hope. Music and poetry were also powerful emotional outlets. Viking poets, known as skalds, composed verses that celebrated bravery, love, and adventure. Their poetry was often rhythmic and dramatic, making it easy to remember and recite aloud. A skilled storyteller or poet could hold the attention of everyone in the longhouse. These performances brought energy and laughter into the dark evenings. Even humor played a role in survival. Jokes and playful teasing between family members helped reduce tension and lighten the mood during stressful times. In close quarters where many people lived together for months, maintaining good spirits was essential. Friendship and companionship were also sources of strength. Neighbors visited each other when weather allowed. Guests were welcomed warmly because travelers brought news from distant settlements. Stories about distant lands and foreign markets offered glimpses of a wider world beyond the snow-covered fields. These visits helped break the monotony of winter and reminded people that they were part of a larger network of communities. As the weeks passed, people began noticing subtle signs of change. The sun lingered slightly longer above the horizon. Snow sometimes softened during midday. Birds occasionally appeared in the sky. These small signs reminded everyone that winter would eventually end. For Vikings, endurance was a deeply respected quality. Surviving the long northern winter was proof of strength, discipline, and unity. Families that worked together, sharing food, labor, and stories, emerged stronger when spring finally arrived. But winter survival did not only shape daily life. Over generations, it shaped the entire Viking culture. Their ability to endure harsh climates helped them become skilled explorers, sailors, and settlers across some of the coldest regions of the North Atlantic. In the next part, we will explore how surviving these brutal winters helped prepare Vikings for exploration, including their voyages across the ocean to new lands.
Health and survival in the cold. Winter in the far north tested more than just strength and courage. Even with warm houses, food, clothing, and careful travel, Viking communities had to contend with illness, injury, and the physical strain of the cold. Surviving winter required knowledge, preparation, and communal care. One of the most common challenges was frostbite and hypothermia. Exposure to extreme cold for too long could damage fingers, toes, ears, and noses. In severe cases, it could lead to dangerous loss of body heat, slowed heart rate, and unconsciousness. Vikings were aware of these risks, even without modern medical terminology. Layered clothing, fur, and careful planning limited exposure to freezing conditions. Children were taught from a young age how to recognize warning signs and protect themselves. Nutrition also played a role in survival. The preserved foods stored in autumn, dried fish, smoked meat, root vegetables, and grains provided essential calories to generate body heat. Ale and fermented milk added additional nutrients. Communities carefully rationed supplies, knowing that running out of food during a storm could be fatal. People who were undernourished were more susceptible to cold and illness. Illness could strike quickly in winter. The longhouse, while warm, also concentrated people together in a confined space. This made the spread of respiratory infections easier. Coughs, fevers, and colds were common. Although Vikings lacked modern medicine, they used herbs, animal fats, and traditional remedies to treat symptoms. Willow bark, which contains compounds similar to modern aspirin, could reduce pain and fever. Certain plants were boiled to create teas that soothed ailments or helped prevent infections. Injuries from tools, woodworking, hunting, or household chores were another concern. Axes, knives, and sharp woodworking tools could cause serious cuts. Broken bones, sprains, and burns were also risks. Vikings developed basic techniques for treating wounds, such as cleaning cuts, wrapping injuries with cloth, and immobilizing broken limbs using splints made from wood. While these measures were simple, they often saved lives and allowed people to recover enough to continue helping their community. Pregnant women and children were particularly vulnerable during winter. Extra attention was given to their care, including warm bedding, sufficient food, and shelter from storms. Midwives played a critical role in assisting births, and families relied on experience and passed down knowledge to help both mothers and infants survive in harsh conditions. Hygiene was another challenge. Washing in cold water was limited, but Vikings used steam from the hearth and small heated water vessels to clean themselves when possible. Keeping living spaces dry and ventilated, while still warm, helped reduce the risk of respiratory issues and mold-related problems. Mental health also mattered. The long, dark nights could feel oppressive, and isolation from other communities during storms was common. Storytelling, music, games, and social gatherings provided relief. These activities reduced stress, reinforced community bonds, and helped maintain morale during a season when survival depended on cooperation and resilience. Religion and spirituality also provided psychological support. Rituals, offerings, and prayers to the Norse gods such as Odin or Thor helped people feel protected from the dangers of winter. Festivals, even during midwinter, offered moments of joy, reflection, and hope for the return of longer days. Even with all precautions, winter remained dangerous. A sudden blizzard could isolate a settlement, a failed food supply could bring hunger, and illness or injury could be deadly if help was not immediately available. Survival required careful planning, constant attention to the environment, and the willingness of every community member to contribute. Despite these challenges, Viking communities endured. Their combination of shelter, layered clothing, preserved food, warmth from animals and hearths, careful travel, and communal care allowed them to survive winters that would have overwhelmed many others. Over generations, this knowledge became refined into traditions that ensured continuity and resilience. In the next part, we will explore winter festivals, traditions, and cultural practices that helped Vikings cope with the darkness, maintain morale, and strengthen social bonds during the harsh Arctic months. How winter survival shaped Viking exploration. The long winters of the North did more than simply test Viking endurance. Over generations, the skills required to survive these harsh seasons shaped the Viking people into some of the most capable explorers of the medieval world. The same knowledge that allowed them to endure freezing darkness at home also prepared them for journeys across unknown seas and distant lands. Life in Scandinavia demanded resilience. From childhood, Vikings learned how to prepare for extreme weather, conserve resources, and work together as a community. They understood how to build strong shelters, preserve food, repair tools, and navigate dangerous landscapes. These abilities created a culture that was highly adaptable. When spring returned and the ice melted, the same people who had spent months inside the longhouse suddenly turned outward toward the sea. The ocean became a path to opportunity. During the early medieval period, many Viking communities faced limited farmland. Mountainous terrain and rocky soil made large-scale agriculture difficult in some areas. As population slowly grew, people began looking beyond their local valleys for new resources and new land. Their experience surviving winter played a major role in making these journeys possible. Vikings were already accustomed to planning months in advance. They knew how to store food, maintain equipment, and manage long periods away from reliable supplies. These skills were essential for long sea voyages, where storms, hunger, and uncertainty were constant threats. Their ships were equally important. Viking shipbuilders developed vessels that were both strong and flexible. Long ships were built with overlapping wooden planks that allowed them to bend with the waves rather than break. This design made them ideal for traveling across rough northern seas. During winter months, many parts of ships were repaired or prepared inside workshops or longhouses. Sailcloth was inspected, ropes were twisted and strengthened, and wooden parts were carved and shaped. By the time spring arrived, ships were ready to launch. Navigation in the Viking world relied on observation and experience rather than instruments. Sailors studied the position of the sun, the movement of stars, the direction of winds, and even the behavior of birds. These observational skills were strengthened during winter evenings when elders shared knowledge about the natural world. Young sailors listened carefully as experienced navigators described distant coastlines, safe harbors, and dangerous currents. This oral tradition passed vital knowledge from one generation to the next. The courage required to face the unknown was also rooted in Viking culture. Stories told during winter nights often celebrated explorers and warriors who traveled far from home. These tales encouraged younger members of the community to imagine distant lands and adventures. Gradually, Viking ships began traveling farther each year. First, they sailed along the coasts of Scandinavia and nearby islands. Then they ventured across the North Sea to the British Isles. Later voyages carried them westward into the North Atlantic. One of the most remarkable explorers of the Viking Age was Eric the Red. Eric was known for his bold personality and willingness to seek opportunity beyond familiar lands. After being exiled from Iceland, he sailed west and discovered a vast icy land that he named Greenland. The name was likely chosen to attract settlers, even though much of the land was covered in ice. Despite the harsh environment, Viking settlers established communities there. Their experience with cold climates helped them adapt to the challenging conditions. These settlements relied on many of the same survival strategies used in Scandinavia: turf houses, livestock management, and careful food storage. From Greenland, Viking explorers continued even farther west. Around the year 1000, a voyage led by Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, reached the shores of North America. Leif and his crew arrived in a land they called Vinland. This discovery occurred nearly 5 centuries before Christopher Columbus reached the Americas. Although Viking settlements in North America did not last long, their voyages demonstrated how far these explorers were willing to travel. Their success was not based on luck alone. It came from a culture built on preparation, endurance, and cooperation.
Surviving the brutal winters of the North had taught Vikings how to manage risk, conserve resources, and remain calm in difficult situations. Every winter spent repairing tools, sharing stories, and strengthening community bonds contributed to their readiness for exploration. Even the mental discipline required to endure months of darkness helped prepare sailors for long ocean voyages, where isolation and uncertainty were common. The Viking spirit of exploration therefore grew directly from the environment they lived in. Harsh winters forced people to become resourceful. Limited farmland encouraged them to seek new territories. Strong communities supported individuals willing to take risks. Together, these factors transformed a group of northern farmers and fishermen into legendary explorers whose journeys reshaped the map of the medieval world. Yet despite their adventures abroad, the Viking homeland remained central to their lives. Every voyage eventually returned to the familiar sight of snow-covered mountains, frozen rivers, and the welcoming glow of a longhouse hearth. And it was there, in those homes built of timber and turf, that the cycle of survival continued year after year. In the final part, we will explore the lasting legacy of Viking winter survival and how their knowledge of cold climates still fascinates historians and archaeologists today.
The legacy of Viking winter survival. For the Vikings, winter was not simply a difficult season that had to endure. Over generations, it became one of the most powerful forces shaping their culture, their technology, and their understanding of the world. The ability to survive months of cold, darkness, and isolation left a lasting mark on their society, one that historians and archaeologists continue to study today. When modern people imagine the Viking Age, they often think first of longships, warriors, and distant voyages. But behind those dramatic images was something more fundamental, a deep knowledge of how to live in a demanding environment. The frozen winters of Northern Europe forced Viking communities to develop systems that were both practical and efficient. Their longhouses were carefully engineered structures. Thick turf walls insulated families from freezing winds. Central hearths provided shared warmth for everyone inside. Animals were sometimes sheltered near the living space, adding another source of heat. These designs were not random. They were the result of centuries of experience and experimentation. Archaeological discoveries across Scandinavia, Iceland, and Greenland showed just how effective these buildings were. Excavations have revealed the foundations of longhouses buried beneath layers of soil and grass. Even after hundreds of years, the basic structure of these homes can still be identified. The study of these sites allows researchers to understand how Vikings arranged their living spaces and how they adapted to winter conditions. One important location where archaeologists have found evidence of Viking life is L'Anse aux Meadows in modern-day Canada. This site contains the remains of Viking buildings constructed around the year 1000. The structures were built using turf walls similar to those found in Scandinavian settlements. The discovery of this settlement confirmed that Norse explorers had reached North America long before later European voyages. Just like their homes in Scandinavia, these buildings were designed to protect their inhabitants from cold winds and harsh weather. Food preservation methods used by Vikings also demonstrate their understanding of winter survival. Dried fish, smoked meat, fermented dairy products, and stored grains formed a reliable food supply during months when fresh food was impossible to obtain. These preservation techniques were simple but extremely effective. Many of these methods are still used in various parts of the world today. Clothing technology was another area where Viking knowledge proved remarkably advanced for its time. Layered garments made from linen, wool, leather, and fur provided protection against freezing temperatures. Wool, in particular, remained one of the most valuable materials in Viking society because of its ability to retain warmth even when damp. Archaeologists studying preserved textiles have discovered that Viking weaving techniques were highly skilled. Patterns and dyes found in some clothing fragments reveal both practicality and artistic creativity. The social structure of Viking communities also contributed to winter survival.
Families lived and worked together in close cooperation. Every person had responsibilities that supported the household. Elders shared knowledge gained from experience. Children learned skills from a young age. This system created strong communities capable of facing difficult conditions. Winter was also a time when cultural traditions were strengthened. Storytelling, poetry, music, and games helped maintain morale during long dark nights. These traditions preserved history and taught important values such as courage, loyalty, and resilience. The stories about gods like Odin and Thor were more than entertainment. They reflected the Viking belief that strength and perseverance were essential qualities for facing the challenges of life. Modern historians often point out that the Viking ability to endure winter conditions helped prepare them for their remarkable voyages across the North Atlantic. Explorers such as Leif Erikson carried with them the knowledge of survival developed in their northern homeland. The same skills that allowed them to live through freezing winters also helped them establish settlements in distant places. Understanding weather patterns, preserving food, building strong shelters, and working together as a community were all essential abilities for explorers traveling far from home. Even today, the legacy of Viking winter survival continues to influence modern understanding of life in cold climates. Architects studying traditional turf houses sometimes draw inspiration from their natural insulation. Historians and anthropologists examine Viking settlements to learn how early societies adapted to extreme environments. Outdoor enthusiasts and survival experts also study Viking clothing systems and food preservation techniques as examples of practical solutions developed long before modern technology existed. The Viking story reminds us that human survival does not depend only on tools or technology. It also depends on cooperation, creativity, and the willingness to learn from the environment. For centuries, the people of Scandinavia faced winters that could easily destroy unprepared communities. Yet through careful planning, strong social bonds, and practical knowledge, they created a way of life that allowed them not only to survive, but to thrive. Their homes remained warm even without large fireplaces. Their food supplies lasted through months of snow and ice. Their stories and traditions kept spirits strong during the darkest nights of the year. When spring finally returned and the ice melted from the seas, Viking ships once again set sail. But every voyage, every adventure, and everyday discovery began in the same place, a quiet longhouse standing against the northern wind, where families gathered around a glowing hearth while winter raged outside. And in those humble homes, the knowledge of survival was passed from one generation to the next, ensuring that the Vikings would endure the frozen north for centuries to come.